Schools were not built for you, or for me, or for anybody whose brain doesn't sit perfectly still. And it's not just schools, it's offices, it's governments, it's basically any system that asks human beings to perform consistently so that they're easy to manage, like a machine. And these systems are most often not malicious either. No one has to sit in a room to exclude people because the system does that automatically because they're built that way. Completely indifferent to human variation in the name of efficiency. But efficiency always comes with a trade-off because when you standardize a system, you inevitably misalign with the human in that very system. Maybe these systems are important. They influence the developing brain, often in ways that nobody notices until much later. So in this episode, we are going to slow that down and shine a light on the collision of brains versus bureaucracy. It's just fun to say that way. Say it with me, bureaucracy. So in chapter 1, we'll explore why systems standardize in the first place. In chapter 2, we'll look at what happens next, how complex humans get compressed into data. Then in chapter 3, we'll go one step further and examine how those systems work quietly to control our behavior. And then in the conclusion, we'll ask a question that systems rarely consider. What is the cognitive toll of all of this? And why do we keep asking what is wrong with us and not asking what is wrong with the system? Let's get into it. Detox starts now. Something's not right here with this. Is it the flappy bits? Because that's not even really a top at that point. I want to talk about... What are we talking about? I want to talk about systems. Yeah. Literally, whatever. Chapter 1. Why systems standardize. Understanding a human being is complex work that requires a willingness to hold contradictions. Two people can show the exact same behavior but be engaging in that behavior for two completely different reasons. And oftentimes, systems are not capable of understanding that kind of nuance. These systems are designed so people move through processes at scale. That means they are optimized not to understand, but to coordinate. Coordination depends on simplification. The more people a system can handle, the more it relies on standardization to remain functional. Standardization allows a system to function without needing to deeply interpret each individual person. But in doing so, they inevitably make assumptions about the kinds of people moving through that system. And these assumptions are everywhere. In schools, students are asked to sustain their attention for fixed periods, then quickly transition between tasks on command, and then demonstrate learning in consistent formats. Sounds like a lot. In workplaces, employees are expected to maintain stable productivity, regulate their emotions, and react predictably to demands. All of these expectations and countless other ones assume that attention, memory, and your executive functioning are relatively stable traits that can be deployed on demand. But cognitive neuroscience disagrees. Executive functioning skills like working memory and cognitive flexibility are processes that vary across individuals over time. And like we talked about in our last episode, a lot of factors like sleep, stress, prior knowledge, genetics, eating habits, and emotional state all significantly influence how those systems operate. The takeaway is that the very cognitive capacities that systems rely on are inherently unstable, and this mismatch becomes more clear once we start to consider how both brains and institutions manage limited resources. There's a concept called the expected value of control, and it describes how the brain allocates cognitive effort effort based on the perceived cost and benefits. All that means is that any effort that you put forth into the world is metabolically expensive, and our brains are constantly filling out those cost-benefit analyses in order to decide whether you should do something or not. So if your brain does that assessment and figures out that a task is not worth the investment of time, money, or effort, attention then is not willpower. You are not making that choice. It's an economic decision that's made by your nervous system. And institutions make very similar calculations. Flexibility, individualization, responsiveness, all of this takes time. It takes labor. Money, girl, it takes money. And systems most often don't want to outlay that money. So, by contrast, standardization is very efficient. And because of the ease of this standardization process from the system side, these structures will often favor in ways that minimize complexity, even if those structures misalign with how humans actually function. And the effects of the system that we are feeling and seeing right now, their legacy precedes us. Before industrialization, most human activity wasn't standardized in the way that we recognize now. Work was local. It was variable, and it was often tied to the change of the seasons or specific trades. And most learning opportunities looked like an apprenticeship versus instruction. There was variation, there was inconsistency, but also a closer alignment between people and the work that they were doing. And this began to change during the Industrial Revolution when production moved into centralized factories, and the challenge became coordination at scale. And this required a new kind of structure that could regulate time and behavior and the output of many individuals simultaneously. A factory depends on predictability. Tasks are broken down into the most easily consumable step. Time is segmented and controlled. Output is measured and compared. The goal was consistency, not variation. And as this model expanded, it began to shape other institutions, including schools. If you look at the modern public education classroom, you can tell that it has adopted structures that mirror this industrial logic. You have fixed schedules, you have age-based groupings, and uniform expectations. And school was designed in this way because it was a solution to a logistical problem. How do you manage large groups of students efficiently while preparing them for participation in similarly structured systems of work? Henry Ford is catching strays, and we can't move on in this chapter without talking about Frederick Winslow Taylor, the godfather of social efficiency. A big part of the scientific management movement in society was due to a man by the name of Frederick Winslow Taylor. He focused on optimizing labor by analyzing tasks, standardizing procedures, and minimizing inefficiency, which, like we just talked about, was developed originally for industrial settings, not schools. And then across time, most of our world systems became bureaucratic. Systems that were organized around rules, hierarchy, and formal procedures, and everything is designed to ensure consistency and control. Bureaucracies are highly effective at coordinating large groups of people because they reduce the need for individualization. Instead of adapting to each person, they create a standardized process that everyone is expected to follow. And this is where the tension with human cognition comes into play. Because even within the same person, cognitive capacity is not stable. Attention is not something that you just have or pull out of your pocket. It's something that is continuously regulated as you go about your day. From a neuroscience perspective, effort itself is a limited resource. But these systems that were built on bureaucratic and industrial logic don't accommodate to any kind of variability easily. They rely on consistency to function. So instead of adapting to human variability, they expect humans to adapt to them. And over time, that expectation becomes invisible. Because over time, these productivity metrics and behavioral expectations begin to feel like common sense, rather than design choices, when they are in fact historical artifacts. They were solutions to specific problems of scale, efficiency, and control that have been carried forward into contexts that are not appropriate and that they were not designed for. While it's not inherently a bad thing because these systems made large-scale coordination possible, they also established a very powerful and destructive baseline, the standard against which everything else is measured. This is where the idea of the average becomes a problem, because many systems are designed around an assumed norm, a typical user with typical capacities. And research on human variability consistently shows that there is no single configuration of traits that represents an average person. Instead, individuals exhibit what is called the jaggedness principle, where strengths and weaknesses vary independently across different dimensions. Who knew human beings were complex? I don't know, how about every human being? Okay, calm down. So when you design for the average, it often results in environments that fit no one perfectly because you built it for the average. Because when you build for the average, you build for no one. And then if you have a space that is built for no one, people start to struggle, and it's interpreted as an individual deficit. So the individual becomes the site of intervention while the systems remain invisible. What this says to me is that behavior is not an individual trait. It is an interaction between the person and the system that they are in. When systems are rigid, individuals have to put in more effort to align with them. When systems are more responsive, the effort can decrease, and different levels of behavior will come out. Once you recognize that pattern, it becomes difficult to ignore because the question shifts. It is no longer just about whether people are meeting expectations, but about how those expectations were constructed in the first place and who they were meant to fit. So if systems cannot accommodate complexity, the natural next step here isn't to try and understand humans more, it's how to compress them into data. I am a data-driven doll. Chapter 2, compressing humans into data. So if systems cannot accommodate complexity, the next problem is interpretation. You have thousands, sometimes millions of people moving through the same system. You need ways in order to make sense of them quickly, not in a way that captures who they are, but in a way that allows the system to function as it was intended. So systems translate people into something simpler. They make them legible. Political scientist James Scott uses the idea of legibility to describe how institutions simplify complex human realities into categories that can be monitored and controlled. So humans become legible in the same way that forests become lumber inventories, in the same ways that cities become grids, and people just become numbers. So the system is not seeking accuracy in the human sense, it is seeking usability in a system sense. And once you see that pattern, you will see it everywhere. In schools, students become grades. In workplaces, people become key performance indicators. Online, we just become clicks and watch time. It's the same move in different systems. Datification, honey. Datification is the process of turning aspects of human life into quantifiable data that can be tracked and analyzed. Hey, it's not Henry Ford this time, it's Mark Zuckerberg. Learning analytics track how long students spend on tasks. Workplace software monitors keystrokes and response times. Even attention, one of the most complex cognitive processes we have, is now something that is being monitored by Google in an attempt to measure and optimize through things like gaze tracking and click-through rates. These huge systems have to reduce each human process down to its most stable signal in order to assess the process itself. The problem is that human processes are almost never stable. So if we think of attention is noisy, it's context dependent, and it's deeply tied to meaning and emotion and our previous experiences, right? See my episode on attention. When you reduce attention down to time on task or completion rates, you're not measuring attention, you're measuring a proxy. And proxies can be dangerous because they look precise, but they're also distorting reality. And this is a known issue within measurement science. When a proxy becomes a target, behavior shifts to optimize the metric rather than the underlying goal. And this is a phenomenon that is often referred to as the Goodhart's law. So in education, this shows up when learning becomes secondary to performance. Students don't study to understand, students study to achieve the measurable outcome, the test. In workplaces, employees don't necessarily do the most meaningful work, they do the work that is visible and countable. The system does not ask, did this matter? The system asks, can this be measured? And if the answer is no, it slowly stops mattering. And this creates a quiet but considerable shift in what we value. And if we don't value curiosity because it's inefficient, if we don't value exploration because it's risky, then depth becomes optional because none of these things compress into data points well. And that's a really dark gray world. Sorry, the Red Bull. We've talked about social media a bit, but there is another technological layer to this that's relatively new. As systems become more data-driven, they increasingly rely on algorithms to interpret the data they collect, because no team of people can go through billions of data points that our technology is collecting from all around us every day. And these algorithms do not understand context in the same way that humans do. They just detect patterns, and these patterns are only as good as the data that they're trained on. There's a lot of research on algorithmic bias, and it shows that when systems are trained on incomplete or skewed data, they reproduce and sometimes amplify existing inequalities. So in education, predictive analytics can flag students at risk based on historical patterns, which then influences how students are labeled and treated. And then in workplace, performance algorithms can reinforce narrow definitions of productivity that disadvantage people who just work differently. So now we are compressing humans into data, and then we are making decisions about those humans because of that data. And the more complex of a person you are, the more likely it is that something important will get lost in that translation. From a cognitive perspective, this is absolutely absurd because human learning itself is not linear or easily observable. It includes so many different internal processes that don't always produce immediate visible outputs. Some of the most important moments in learning look like confusion or just going down the wrong path, but a system that relies on visibility, those moments don't read as learning, they read as failure. So they get corrected, and over time, people adapt to prioritize what is legible over what is meaningful. And this is where things start to blur between design and identity. See my episode on identity. Once you are consistently represented through simplified metrics, it becomes very easy to internalize those representations. A grade stops feeling like feedback and starts feeling like your personality. A performance review stops being situational and seems like a judgment on who you are. And all of these things quietly tell us who we are allowed to be in those systems. So when we talk about the data, we're talking about translations, and like any translation, you are going to lose things. The question is not whether systems should measure anything at all, because if we want systems, they will have to measure something. The question is what happens when that measurement becomes more real than the person being measured. Because once that happens, you're navigating a system that only knows a summary of a person. Which brings us to Chapter 3, Training the Brain to Fit the System. So by the time somebody has spent enough time in any system, it's no longer something that they're navigating. It becomes something that they internalize. While systems do measure behavior, they also begin to shape it gradually through patterned interactions. Decades of research in behavioral science demonstrate that behavior is shaped by contingencies. What is reinforced becomes more likely, and what is punished or extinguished becomes less so. But in modern institutional environments, these contingencies are rarely explicit. They are embedded in subtle social signs. This is what some people call the hidden curriculum, and it's a set of implicit lessons individuals learn about behavior and identity by just participating in an institution. In schools, the hidden curriculum teaches far more than the academic content. School teaches you how to wait, how to comply, how to prioritize, how to have goals, how to regulate yourself. And over time, these patterns become automatic. And from the perspective of predictive processing, suggesting that the brain is constantly generating and updating its predictions about the world, behavior is shaped by immediate feedback and learned expectations. And the brain becomes increasingly efficient at anticipating what is required in a given environment and adjusting its behavior in advance, and people begin to pre-correct themselves. Because at some point our brains can anticipate what is going to be rewarded and inhibit what might cause friction. In other words, they align themselves before misalignment even is visible, and this is not a conscious act in most cases. And then these things become learned predictions, which is incredibly efficient for the system because it comes at a cost. The more you rely on anticipatory self-regulation, the more cognitive effort you're allowing towards monitoring yourself versus engaging with any task itself. Sustained, effortful control, especially when it involves suppression of a natural response, draws heavily on limited cognitive resources and processing, and then makes you feel fatigued over time. And this is where masking comes into play. So masking refers to the process of modifying or suppressing natural behaviors in order to conform to expected norms. And while this is most often talked about in the neurodivergence context, the underlying mechanism, behavioral adaptation to reduce social or institutional friction, is far more widespread than just neurodiverse people. In many structured environments, masking becomes a baseline requirement. People learn to suppress confusion versus look at it. Maintain eye contact with people regardless of comfortability. Appear attentive even when completely disengaged, and regulate your emotional responses to align with our expectations. And we learn to do this constantly. This creates a situation where outward behavior appears stable and compliant, but internally, cognitive load is significantly elevated. The brain is processing a task, but also managing impression, regulation, and prediction simultaneously, and over time this has measurable consequences. Because research on cognitive load theory suggests that when our working memory is overloaded, learning and performance both suffer. So if a significant portion of that load is being allocated towards self-monitoring and just controlling your own behavior, less capacity remains for deeper cognitive processes like reasoning, problem solving, and integration. Three things that undoubtedly are useful in most systems. So oftentimes what looks like disengagement is often cognitive saturation. What looks like a lack of effort is often misallocated effort, and systems rarely account for that distinction. Instead, they interpret visible behavior at face value and just try to correct, which increases the regulatory demand that creates a feedback loop. And then you just, yeah. This is something that's aligned very closely with what sociologists describe as internalized regulation, where external expectations become self-imposed standards. And at this stage, individuals are enforcing the systems on themselves. They monitor their own behavior to align with the expectations, even in the absence of external pressure. And this is where systems become most efficient, because control is no longer external, it lives inside the people moving through the system. So what we may interpret as professionalism may in some cases just be a reduction in behavioral range. So if you internalize the rules of the system, it begs the question, what is the toll of complying with all of the system's demands? Because what most of us think as normal is not normal or neutral at all. In fact, it is engineered. In Chapter 1, we looked at where that engineering came from. In Chapter 2, we saw what happens next. Once systems are standardized, they need a way to process the people inside them so they compress. And then in Chapter 3, we talked about how people internalize that system. So by the time we take a step back and ask, why do people behave this way? What we're looking at oftentimes is the result of design and not nature. And that brings us to a part that, in my opinion, does not get talked about enough, the cost. People behaving in this way, where they are self-policing their own behavior in order to conform to a system, requires every flavor of effort: cognitive, emotional, physical, and just that slow, low burn of constant regulation. We've been taught to think about productivity as output, but we rarely account for the cognitive load just to appear productive within a system that relies on visibility. And this is where I want to bring us back to something that I think about constantly: optics. There is a difference between doing your job and looking like you're doing your job. And in a lot of places, those two things are not completely aligned. If you haven't thought about this before, I'm really sorry, because it gets a little sad and it changes the way that you see everything, but stay with me. A good example for me is from working in schools. And at the end of the day, I want to leave. I'm not sure if it's the ADHD in me that always makes me feel like I'm in a rush when I'm in a transitional period, but the key is, I like to leave as soon as the day is done. Once class is over, I have no cognitive capacity to plan lessons or organize my classroom. Both of those things require meaningful thought, of which, at 3:50, I'm not capable of. And yet, there is this quiet expectation for teachers to not look done. And no matter what field you're in, I bet there are things that you do just to make sure that your presence reads as working. When I leave, when the actual workday is done, sometimes it feels like I'm breaking an unspoken rule about what effort is supposed to look like. So some of us start performing presence. And within that performance, we are actively becoming less productive. And when systems rely on visible proxies for effort, people start optimizing for perception instead of impact. Organizational research has shown that environments emphasizing visibility encourage performative productivity. And this is defined as behaviors that signal effort without necessarily improving outcomes. And once that becomes the norm, time and cognitive resources get diverted away from meaningful work and towards maintaining appearances. Are you kidding? From a cognitive perspective, this is so completely backwards. Every moment that you spend managing optics is a moment not spent on actual thinking, actual recovery, or actual learning. So we end up in this strange predicament where looking productive can reduce productivity, looking engaged can replace engagement, and looking like a good worker becomes more important than being an effective worker. And listen, most people know this, they feel it, but what's happening behind the scenes is our brains are tracking what gets noticed, and then our brains adapt. And this is the cognitive toll of fitting in. It's about forcing your cognition in this way that is misaligned with how our brains actually function, and then spending additional energy disguising that misalignment. So our brains are doing a task and managing the performance of the task at the same time. It's regulation inception, and eventually something has to give. This is a design problem, not a human problem. Brains are built for curiosity, experimentation, and adaptive reasoning. When the system becomes the arbiter of value, it reshapes our behavior. Compliance cannot be the endpoint, but rather a byproduct of a system that is not a barrier to human potential. So the next time that you notice somebody struggling to fit in, don't ask, what's wrong with them? Ask, what's wrong with the system? Because the problem most often is not the human, it's the system that human is in. It's the ultimate design principle. Respect the cognitive architecture of the humans inside the system, or be prepared to watch the brilliance leak out through the cracks. That's my mic drop. That's so it. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next one real soon. Goodbye. Ow! How is that 50 minutes?